I think 1 or 2 more minutes just to make sure we've got enough people to begin. Okay, I think we'll begin. We've got a fair few people on the line now. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the session. My name is Miriam Thompson, and I'm the CEO of CAF, and I'll be moderating the discussion today. I'll begin today's session with an acknowledgement of country. As we come together to discuss matters of ethical management of the built environment, we recognise the deep and enduring connection that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have to this land. We acknowledge that this land was never ceded and remains, as it always was, Aboriginal land. I acknowledge the Gadigal people, the traditional owners of the land from which CAF is hosting this webinar today, as well as the traditional owners of the various lands on which you're calling in from today. Before we get started, I'm going to go through a bit of general housekeeping. This session is being recorded and will be a moderated discussion that will run for approximately 40 minutes, followed by questions and answers at the end. If you have a question at any point, please type it in the Q&A chat box and we'll come back to it at the end, and you'll also have the opportunity to ask your question live at the end of the session if you prefer. Today's session is on secure work. We'll be looking at what happens when secure work is absent, and we'll be looking at the role of secure work not only in protecting workers against exploitation, but as a fundamental factor in the pursuit of decent work. I'm really pleased to be hosting this discussion today, and it's one that I've wanted us to have for many years. Through the CAF certification scheme, we've witnessed the impact of insecure work on cleaners' lives and livelihoods. We've observed instances where supply chain stakeholders took very little interest in cleaners' job security, and also instances where they implemented several measures to promote it. As most attendees know, one of the key things we do at CAF is audit workplaces. From an auditing standpoint, insecure work makes it extremely difficult to assess all other labour standards. Put simply, workers who do not feel secure in their employment are unlikely to raise any issues with their boss, a union representative, or a third party like CAF. This means that a range of labour issues they may be experiencing will go undetected. Conversely, when workers are securely employed, we typically see happier workforces that have predictable hours of work and income, and who are able to plan for the future and are confident to advocate for themselves and others. On our panel today, we have 3 excellent speakers. To begin with, we have Rebecca Stark. Rebecca is a coordinator of property services at the United Workers Union and is responsible for the union's investor strategy and stakeholder engagement. Rebecca has worked in the union movement for over 15 years in various research, campaign, responsible investment and capital stewardship roles. Throughout that time, she has maintained a focus on working with the union's cleaning members to campaign for better wages and conditions and to ensure their hard work is valued and respected. In 2013, Rebecca worked with CAF's founding partner, Australian Super, to set up the Cleaning Accountability Framework, CAF, and now serves as a non-executive director on our board. Second, Martijn Bosma is an associate professor in work and organisational studies at the University of Sydney Business School. His earlier engagements at Greenpeace International and in the trade union movement exposed him to the complex realities of corporate accountability. He researches the ways in which businesses respond to modern slavery and labour exploitation. His work highlights how robust governance models can integrate social and environmental values into broader corporate objectives, advancing more sustainable and equitable ways of doing business. I should also mention that Rebecca and Martijn both sit on the CAF Independent Certification Panel and have direct insight into the systemic issues in the cleaning industry and how they're being addressed through CAF certification and contractor pre-qualification. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Christine Wagland, who has been a contract cleaner since 1984 for the Department of Defence in Canberra. She has worked for 6 different companies, cleaning companies, servicing the Department of Defence during that time. And then in the next 12 months, she will undergo yet another contract change. Christine's association with CAF is an enduring one, as she was involved in the design of CAF Building Certification Scheme and spoke at the launch of that service in 2019. Before we jump into the discussion, I will ask each panellist to share briefly their initial views on why secure work matters and how their professional background informs their views on the matter. I will ask each of you to keep it to one or 2 minutes, as we'll have plenty of time to unpack things throughout the discussion that will follow. I will begin with Christine.
Good morning. I have worked for the Department of Defence, as Miriam said, for 41 years this October. It would seem that I have had secure work. While it has been ongoing, it has only ever been secure for periods of time after I passed probation and before it went out to tender again. Probation used to be 4 weeks, now it's 6 months. Every time the contract changed, I'd have to reapply for a job I was already doing with no guarantee I would get it. All financial decisions made during my married life weren't just between my husband and I. It was also where we were in the life cycle of the contract, buying a car, borrowing money to do work to our house, holidays, all dependent or not on whether I kept my job. Secure work matters because I have spent far too much time, here comes my cat, go away, far too much time over the years worrying about, should I get the same hours, would I get the same shift? I have English as a first language and it was stressful, but for those who don't, it's a nightmare. All for the want of a clause in the contract that says employ all cleaners working on site. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Martijn, over to you.
Thanks, Miriam. My background as an academic researching working conditions and how working conditions can deteriorate over time, sometimes resulting in severe forms of labor exploitation, revolves around all those elements that can, I suppose, stop that from occurring. And clearly, having a secure job, having predictable hours, having job stability, knowing that as Christine said, that you have consistent and reliable hours, that you can plan for your future. Those are all elements that I suppose tip the scale in favor of actually moving away from modern slavery towards actually advancing towards decent work. And hence I'm actually I'm excited to be part of this panel in the first place. But typically these panels that I'm part of, there's always an emphasis to look at the way in which stuff gets worse. And I think having a conversation about secure work and the benefits of secure work actually pivots that conversation towards looking at how you can actually establish more of a decent work agenda. So in that sense, it's really incredibly important to sort of, I suppose, frame the conversation in a positive way, which is also nice for a change. So I'm looking forward to hearing from everyone today.
Thank you, Martijn. And Rebecca?
Thanks, Miriam, and thanks, Christine and Martijn, for your comments. So I've worked as a union official and with our cleaning members at United Workers Union for almost 2 decades. And over that time, I've seen many improvements, particularly in the commercial cleaning sector. So this is a nice way to start with a positive. It's not going to stay that way, but I will come back to it. I would say overall there is more awareness of the vulnerability of cleaners and the prevalence of exploitation. And procurers have generally taken on a greater level of responsibility when it comes to the working conditions of cleaners in their supply chain. So they're positive developments, I think, that we can recognise. However, when it comes to secure work, nothing has really changed for cleaners over the last 2 decades. And in fact, with the current cost of living crisis, arguably things have gotten worse. Unfortunately, cleaning is one of the industries in Australia where secure jobs are the exception and not the norm. So most cleaning jobs are outsourced to contractors rather than cleaners being directly employed by the property owner or the tenant. And contract cleaning is inherently insecure work with no guarantees of regular hours, ongoing employment or stable wages and working conditions. So it is a feature of the industry, and it's a feature of outsourcing. Insecure work is a deliberate business strategy that shifts risks and costs from employers to employees, undermining workers' rights and economic stability. So in that context, why does secure work matter? Well, cleaners who work in secure, stable jobs with steady incomes are more productive and valued and less vulnerable to exploitation. When workers have secure jobs, they're more likely to be engaged and productive and are able to participate fully in society. So they can afford to pay their mortgage or their rent on time, put food on the table, take their kids to weekend sport, and buy all the essentials they need to lead a comfortable life. At a macroeconomic level, workers with secure jobs have greater purchasing power, which supports local economies and helps to create sustainable growth. Security of employment leads to greater economic equality and improved social cohesion. So you only need to look at Trump's America to see the corrosive impact of economic insecurity and inequality on democracy and on society as a whole. We definitely don't want to import that here. Finally, secure work also leads to greater security and dignity in retirement. So workers with unbroken work patterns and secure employment are much more likely to retire owning their own home and with sufficient superannuation savings.
Thanks, Beck. Thanks, Martijn and Chris, for your earlier intros. Now I'll kick off the discussion more proper. And my first question is for Martijn. Now, Martijn, can you help us set the scene at a high level? What is secure work from a sort of legal and rights-based framework?
Yeah, that's a good question, and in part that's already been referred to by Chris and by Rebecca. The idea that you have predictability, stability, consistent hours, ongoing arrangements, which basically, as was just mentioned, allow you to have confidence in your employment status so that you can plan for your future, but also advocate for your interests, right? So if you know that you're going to be, I suppose, employed for a longer period of time, then you might raise an issue that you are experiencing in a workplace. It's really fundamental for having experiencing an appropriate employment relationship in appropriate circumstances. And in Australia, I'd like to think that secure work is foundational in many ways. And with recent changes to the Secure Jobs Better Pay Amendment to the Fair Work Act, we've seen some changes that directly and indirectly, I suppose, create incremental improvements to that. So there are now some limitations on, for example, the use of fixed-term contracts, which is obviously a direct impact. In an indirect sense, we've seen some changes to multi-enterprise bargaining, which obviously in an indirect way makes sure that particularly people from industries with a low barrier of entry are more likely to enter into multi-employer bargaining, in which circumstances they can obviously put demands with regards to secure work to employers, but also, for example, termination of so-called zombie agreements, like the old agreements that had conditions that have been surpassed by awards, but were still used in certain circumstances to, let's say, undercut the market. And obviously, the amendment made in 2022 changes that. Now, I think more broadly, when you talk about secure work, it ties into a number of international dimensions as well. The International Labour Organization's Decent Work Agenda, when we talk about OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, like there are many initiatives at an international level that really articulate secure work as a core component of a decent work agenda. And we do that more broadly in a context where we see, as Beck already said, a shift in risk from employers to workers. Effectively, this is what you see: the insecure work, the unpredictable hours, unstable income, limited or no access to basically basic workplace requirements leaves those workers economically vulnerable, and it shifts that risk again to the workers away from the employers, and that's worrying. And we see that, for example, with the gig economy specifically. And it's oftentimes, this is the last point I'll make in that, we oftentimes see that happen in the context of a cost-cutting exercise. There is a bit of an idea of, and this has been referred to as well before, there's a false economy, if you will, about cost cutting and basically, increasing and propping up investor returns, for example. But there's I suppose, a lack of consideration for the results of that cost cutting, the results of that increased turnover, which leads to increased absenteeism, which leads to higher training costs, which leads to a degree in the quality of service that's being provided. So there's an economic and social costs associated with that. And where on the books you might see a reducing cost for your cleaning contract, there are actually real social and economic costs associated with that is disproportionately borne by the cleaning workforce.
Thanks, Martijn. Rebecca, building on what Martijn has just said, can you explain how insecure work can lead to exploitation and how this manifests very precisely in the cleaning industry?
Okay, so I think it manifests in two sort of key ways in the cleaning industry. One is the contract cycle. So commercial cleaning contracts generally run in 3 to 5 year cycles. And as Chris so articulately put it, every time the contract is up and the tender is out, cleaners are fearful of losing their jobs. They're made to reapply for their jobs if a new contractor is brought in. They're put on 6 months probation, as Chris has already said, even if they've worked at their site for many years and decades in Chris's experience. In the lead up to any contract change, it's also like a really difficult time for cleaners. They experience heightened anxiety. As Chris said, they defer spending money that they might actually really need to spend until they wait to see what the result of the contract change is. Many of the contract changes result in cuts to hours, changes to rosters. They've got to change their whole lives based on what happens in that contract change. And it often results in cleaners' pay and hours being slashed as well. The other thing that happens, which is terrible, particularly in an industry like cleaning where injury rates are so high, is that every time the contract changes, cleaners lose their accrued sick leave. And if there are some states where there are long service leave schemes that have been put in place by the government. So there's a maintenance of long service leave entitlements for some cleaners, but not for all. So, your length of service is really discounted. It's not recognised for cleaners who have worked at a site for many, many years. So there's something inherently unfair about that. In recent years, we've seen contractors also use a form of fixed-term contract for employers that align with the expected expiry date of the cleaning contract, and they do this to avoid paying redundancy entitlements. So, it's another way that they rob workers of, hard fought for and earned entitlements. And then finally, towards the end of a contract, if the outgoing contractor gets an inkling that they're going to lose the contract, they'll often end up sort of pulling resources out of the contract. They won't replace supplies or equipment. They won't replace cleaners who are on leave. And so the remaining cleaners on site are really overworked and it becomes quite dangerous. So that's the first area around contract change. But the second area is really to do with the employment type. So as you would know, there are very few full-time jobs in cleaning. Most cleaning jobs are either part-time or casual. And the prevalence of that sort of form of insecure work means that cleaners simply cannot secure sufficient hours of paid work. They often work irregular hours. They'll work long hours sometimes and short hours and other times, depending on the peak periods of different places they might work at. They'll work multiple jobs to make ends meet. And ultimately, they really do struggle to, in today's world of rising cost of living, they struggle to pay the bills. They struggle to put food on the table. So there are, really difficult impacts that cleaners face every day because of the insecure work that they are in. Casual workers have no access to sick leave or annual leave. So if they fall ill, they lose income, and so many sort of feel pressure to actually go to work sick. So obviously that presents its own dangers. As Martijn has spoken about already, cleaners who are insecure in their work and insecure in their hours often feel reluctant to speak out against poor treatment, against things like wage theft or bullying and harassment, for fear of losing hours or for fear of losing their jobs. And that fear stops those workers from demanding better, really. It stops them from joining their union, speaking up, and asking for the respect and the value they so clearly deserve. When you have multiple layers of subcontracting, insecurity of employment is even greater and exploitation is even greater. So you'll have subbies on the floor. They might be wearing the same uniform. They're being directed what to do. They're basically doing the same job as other cleaners who are employed directly by the primary contractor. However, they're on lower wages and conditions, working for a subcontractor or for a labour hire company, or often they're working in informal arrangements. Where subcontracting occurs, we commonly find greater levels of exploitation and illegal practices. Subcontracted workers are at greater risk of wage theft, with the contracting employer pocketing the difference. They may be paid below the minimum wage or denied proper penalty rates over the weekend or a night shift, or not paid allowances they're owed. They're often employed off the books, working cash in hand. Some may be falsely brought on as independent contractors, so they're told to sign a form, which they're told is an employment form, but it's actually an application for an ABN. And even though they're effectively employees, they're now devoid of all of the rights and entitlements that are actually attached to an employment status because they're falsely brought in as sham contractors. So that presents a pretty bleak picture, and it sort of means that part-time work is the more sort of stable form of work outside of full-time work in cleaning. However, there's been sort of an increasing prevalence towards using part-time workers as casual workers in the cleaning industry to accommodate surge rosters. So those in this form of insecure work, part-time workers are offered contracts of maybe 4 hours a week, whereas previously they may have worked 20 to 30 hours a week. And they sort of ramp up their hours during peak periods. So there's no guarantee of, steady income or hours, no predictability of hours. And it's obviously really hard for cleaners in those situations to manage their lives, their caring responsibilities, their studying. A whole range of impacts sort of flow on as a result of the use of part-time workers as sort of more casual, in a more sort of casual way.
Thanks, Beck. And I'm sure that there are other industries that experience the same types of issues. I think, and potentially industries that your union has members in. So I'm thinking security and maybe aged care. I think that sort of increase towards an on-demand workforce is something that we're seeing generalized across the labour market, unfortunately. So I think, the idea with this discussion is that, we're doing a deep dive into the cleaning industry, but I think a lot of the issues and themes that are coming up as part of this discussion are really valid across a lot of other industries, particularly contracting industries. So thank you, Rebecca and Martijn, for your contributions on this particular question. Now I'd like to turn to a question for Christine. Christine, you've been through 6 contract changes in your time as a cleaner, as you've told us, and you're currently in the midst of yet another one. Can you share from your experience what it's like in the lead up to, during and after the change of contract? How does the contracting cycle affect the broader lives of workers? And happy for you to speak to your own experience, but also to those of your peers. I know that you're a delegate, so you would have insight into some of the issues that your colleagues have faced as a result of this contracting cycle. And I'm also interested to hear some of the complexities that you face when advocating with employers when so much power is actually held by the procurer of the cleaning service rather than the employer themselves.
Yes.
I've added a lot in there.
Just on the last bit, if they'll speak to us was what you need to add in there. Look, overall on the 6 contract changes, which the biggest problem is the lack of communication. Everything's is done by the whisper process. Chinese whispers are alive and well in the Department of Defence, and because the existing contractor won't tell you that the contract's ending and that they haven't got it. Besides the fact they're usually sulking, they're not going to do anything to help an incoming contractor. So and nor will they. It's by word of mouth. So usually I hear a rumour, I call the union, and the union then makes phone calls to get an answer. And this can drag on for up to months while they fiddle around and, for want of a better word, fart about, decide when it's going to end and what they're going to do. And so my existing contractor will not help in any way with putting me in touch or giving the incoming contractor access to me to discuss my future employment because he doesn't care. He's losing the contract. He doesn't have work for me. He's quite happy to terminate me and wash his hands. That's the way it works. So then it's this trying to, and you're on a secure site. So the incoming contractor doesn't have access. And unless the present contractor agrees to escort them in, they're not allowed in the building until the change of contract. I mean, so it is this constant not knowing, of not being in a position to put things in place. More often than not, you're running around outside of work hours to do interviews, medicals, applications, and just an endless time of just being on edge, not knowing, and and really it's just never got better. And this one, I had thought that, you know, maybe that this time that we would that there would be more communication, more understanding, but there hasn't been. And we've had 2 extensions on this contract, and we finally have an end date, which is the 31st of January next year, which is a stupid time because go away CAF, which is a stupid time because everything will have to be sorted out before Christmas. Kat has an opinion. She wants to get in. So, but I still have no idea who my new employer is. My present employer is only given the date verbally. We've received nothing in writing, and we have an EBA with them that ensures that we have above award wages and security allowances and free parking. We finally got a meeting with the union and defence and security guards in January. And that's when basically we were told that what we get paid is between the cleaner and the contractor and nothing to do with them. Of course, they've just let the contractor and 90% of its wages. So and we're all on and wouldn't guarantee our above award rates and conditions, and basically said they had nothing to do with them. So in other words, they've hung us out to dry, and any incoming contractor will only pay the award. And because of that, and not guaranteeing parking, which translates to $1 an hour that a cleaner will lose. And if you're a baseline cleaner with only, and don't get any other security allowances other than slightly above the award, there's $80 a fortnight out of your pay. 5 cleaners have left since January. Now, while Defence thinks, cleaners grow on trees, in this day and age, they don't. And even getting a baseline clearance can take months, and then you can add years in for any higher clearance over that. But this belief that, as Beck and Martine were saying, that they're actually going to save money is an absolute furphy, because technically I'm looking at a 25% pay cut. So if I and my fellow cleaners who hold security clearances leave, there is no one behind us. There is absolutely no one in the system, because no one wants to go through what's required to get security clearances. So Defence are then looking at a workforce that's not cleared. Then they have to pay escorts. So while they're saving money by cutting the cost of the contract, it's just coming out of a different bucket. And the escort bucket, public servants love it because they love escorting. It's the easiest overtime they ever do. And it's not accountable. Nobody mentions the bottomless bucket that they use for escorting, but that will there'll be no full-time day cleaners. There will only be escorted cleaners outside of work hours. And they'll be, as I was running around today, cleaning up spilt coffee before I left the building, they'll be cleaning up their own messes. But it's, where did I get to? Because I went off tangent. I'll say, here we go. And as Beck was saying, while I get paid at annual leave and we have portability of long service leave, I lose accrued sick leave. And yes, I've gone to work sick because I've had no sick leave, and afraid to call in sick because I've been on probation, afraid to upset my new manager because I don't know them, afraid of making a bad impression, afraid of being seen as unreliable. So over 40 years, 40% of my sick leave is walked away in the back pockets of contractors. And the present contractor holds 80 days of accrued sick leave. And yes, they made us all sign fixed term contracts to try and avoid paying redundancy. While that's they haven't got away with that one, it is really annoying that yet again, while I choose to come to work and even when I'm not feeling well, and I have, because there's no one to replace me. There's no one can get in the building during the day, and they can only get in there after hours. And I'll come in and do what has to be done early and then go home, and that works. But that 80 days of sick leave is mine. And really, we still haven't worked out a way that unless it becomes part of another portable sick leave scheme, how that sick leave is protected. And the rest of the sick leave I used as carers leave when my husband got sick. And I was just lucky that I'd had continuous employment for 15 years with one contractor, that I had that much accrued sick leave that I could use.
Thank you, Christine, so much for sharing the reality of this process. And I think, I think everyone on the call will appreciate you weaving in your personal narrative throughout the rest of the discussion. It's a lot. So Rebecca, I think it's worth noting that Christine's workplace is one which, as she said, cleaners are required to hold a certain security clearance level. And part of that involves being an Australian citizen or potentially a permanent resident. But either way, it's a permanent workforce. We know that a significant proportion of cleaners, particularly in metropolitan areas, are on temporary work visas. Are you able to talk to us a bit about the additional layer of vulnerability that migrant workers on temporary visas face and how insecure work affects them more specifically?
Sure. So cleaning jobs have always been taken up by migrant workers in Australia. And with every new wave of migrants that's come through, we've seen changes to the workforce profile in the cleaning industry. So earlier waves of migrants came predominantly from European countries with higher levels of education and understanding of labour laws and the role of unions. And those migrants also tended to come here permanently. They were permanent migrants. But in recent decades, there's a new wave of migrants that's come from, Asia, South America, and Africa, where there's lower levels of education and literacy. Many come from non-English speaking backgrounds. They have a poor knowledge of workers' rights, and many are often either ignorant or distrustful about the role of unions. And layer on top of this, that this wave of migrants is largely coming out here as temporary migrants as well. On temporary sort of work visas or coming here as international students. So any worker here on a temporary visa is much more vulnerable to exploitation due to their visa status. Its vulnerability is even greater for international students, I think, because they're only allowed to work 48 hours a fortnight. And they face significant pressure from their employer often to work beyond their allowable hours. And that makes them much more susceptible to visa-related threats and coercion. So especially in the commercial cleaning industry, you have a high proportion of international students who are really reliant on the work that they get and need more work to be able to meet the cost of living. And they're often trapped in these exploitative situations where employers hang over their heads the threat of deportation or reporting them to authorities if they speak up about exploitation or if they, seek to talk to the union or join the union. So it's a really, they're in a really, really precarious situation. And as a result, you see much more egregious forms of exploitation when it comes to temporary migrants. You'll have cash in hand arrangements, you'll have debt bondage arrangements, cleaners employed as sham contractors made to sign ABM forms, but being treated as employees, being asked to work excessive overtime, irregular hours, effectively being on call at any time. And if they say no to their employer, then they risk losing hours and losing their jobs. So the other sort of factor behind temporary workers is that many are here sort of employed and sponsored by their employer. And so their visa status is heavily reliant upon their employment status. That creates a huge power imbalance where it can become very difficult for employers then to leave exploitative or abusive employers and act as whistleblowers. There's just not enough protections for vulnerable workers in those situations. And of course, given the sort of nature, particularly of that second wave of migrants, many come from countries where there's no knowledge of what, unions or workers' rights. They don't have any sort of understanding of what their full legal rights are in the workplace in Australia, don't know how to report mistreatment due to language barriers and cultural differences. Complex visa laws makes it hard to navigate that as well. And unions are often prevented from accessing workers on site. Our our laws in Australia are still very weak when it comes to allowing unions to access workplaces to talk to vulnerable workers who aren't union members. You know, we can go to a work site where there are members, but it's much harder to go where there are none. So that means, you know, you have these dark spaces, I guess, within the cleaning industries where no light is shone upon the terrible treatment of cleaners there.
Thank you, Beck. So we've been talking about the link between insecure jobs and exploitation. I think we've covered that pretty well. I'd like us to now turn to the topic of how promoting secure work might offer up a preventative and corrective measure when it comes to addressing labour risk. Martijn, could you talk a little bit more about that and how secure work aligns with the broader business and human rights agenda? And I know that you're very active in that particular community.
Yeah, good question. And a lot of this comes back to what's been said again before by both Chris and Beck. Like it's you know, it's not at all a niche concern. Like if you look at secure work and the impact it has, that's obviously real for Chris and other people in the workforce. But that's recognized in all those international frameworks that I referred to before. So it's not like a niche topic that we seem to be focusing on in Australia, where we say, oh, there's a change of contract at a particular, you know, organization, and there's a new cleaner coming in. Like, you might think that's like a niche thing, despite the real impacts that we've just discussed. But you know, whether it is the ILO's decent work agenda, whether it is the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, like we see a big push in these international instruments that are meant to guide responsible business conduct around the world, to set a standard for what work should look like, and a large part of that agenda revolves around secure work. Now, obviously, we started off before by saying, "Oh, I'm looking forward to having this positive discussion." And obviously, we have at times very much veered into sort of the negative impact, and that's unavoidable. But the big legislative push around the world in the EU and in other jurisdictions to I suppose create these circumstances in which we can see secure employment and better work is pushed by those worst case examples of people being exploited. And that is why Australia has a Modern Slavery Act. That is why the UK has a Modern Slavery Act. That's why there are so many other jurisdictions around the world responding in legal terms to these worst types of exploitation. And the reason for that is that just as you can have these multiple factors that contribute to vulnerability, the ones that Beck just outlined, particularly for people that are on temporary visas, that, you know, if you add them all up, if you add them up, the cash in hand payments, if you add up the power imbalance, the fact that you can be asked to do unpaid overtime, the fact that you are afraid of potentially violating the conditions of your visa, you know, the fear of deportation. If you start adding all those up, then you increase what you might call the risk profile for exploitation. But you can do the opposite as well. And this comes to your point, Miriam, about how you can sort of like, I suppose, break that cycle of exploitation and abuse. Like secure employment doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? Like secure employment often goes hand in hand with fair remuneration. It goes hand in hand with appropriate leave entitlements, with leave entitlements that Chris referred to that carry over regardless of whether there's a change in contract. And all those things together then actually elevate the quality of working life. And to come back to the age-old business case that I referred to before, it all also adds to better service provision, happy workforce, reduced turnover, you know, reduced absenteeism, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's a win-win, if you will, for both the employers and the workers here.
Thank you, Martijn. So We are getting close to, I do want to leave some time for Q&A, but there are still a few things I'd like us to run through. So just for the next 5 minutes, if you could keep your answers quite brief. Christine, leading on from what Martine's saying about, I suppose, the business case, that, there are benefits to secure work that flow not only to workers, but also to employers and to their clients, the procurers of cleaning services. Can you talk to us very briefly about the difference in the quality of work between a cleaner who is securely employed versus a cleaner who is insecurely employed?
While it is most contractors will only bid the award unless there's enough money in the contract to pay extra. So it sort of becomes, it has to be an awareness of the client that if they want a better bang for their buck, then they need to spend the money, because it does translate, because the other things flow. So if you've got, as Martine was saying, if you've got where a cleaner is being paid properly and has their appropriate entitlements, they also have a workload that is deliverable and that's not excessive, and they're not required. So, and all cleaners, me personally, enough time to do the job, enough time to do the job properly. And so if you've got a happy cleaner, if you've got a cleaner who's got time to do their work, and if and it's easy to keep their building clean, then you have no problems. You have a cleaner who wants to stay. And we have a nasty habit that we get, and I do this all the time, we get attached to the places we work at. We don't like to move. We don't like to be moved around. We get to know our buildings. We love our buildings, and they're all different. They're all quirky, and especially the people who work in them are all quirky. And especially within the defence and security requirements, they're all different. They've all got different needs, and they like to see the same person. They like to know, and I'll just tell you, sorry, Miriam, I'm going off the side, but I'll tell you, I started work in a secure building, and they'd had a poor run of cleaners, and the contract changed, and I ended up in this building, and I'd been working in the evenings doing the bathrooms, and then it was arranged that I'd start coming in the day to go up and do dusting and wiping doors and just things that were getting missed. So I'd arranged with facilities that I would be starting. So I've started, duster in hand, cloth, bottle of cleaner, off of gone, dusting shelves, wiping and walking down the corridor saying good morning to people. And then within minutes, I've got, I'm being chased by the head of facilities because he's had 4 phone calls from people saying there's a strange woman in the building. Now, and of course then, so you didn't think to speak to her. She's not very scary, but it is, while it was quite funny, yes, it's often, and then the other time, yes, if it's a happy building, then yes, and if you have time to do your work, all things, and we had them, as Beck knows, we had them with the Commonwealth Cleaning Guidelines that ensured that there was money in the contract. And if, and contracts should be let on the ability for a contractor to deliver a reliable service. But it should also be let on a contractor that looks after their workers, who cares about the workers, because they have a stable workforce and they have a loyal workforce, and they have cleaners who'll go out of their way to do something extra because it was asked, because it's easy, I can fix that without, I know I've got time to do that. It all works hand in hand, but yes, it all starts with the money. If the money's not there, the rest does not flow. But yes, I'll stop now.
Thank you, Chris. So we'll be moving into a Q&A very soon. So please prepare any questions or put them in the Q&A box. But prior to the Q&A, I'd just like to invite each panelist in 1 minute or less to share their recommendations for employers and procurers in supply chain industries such as cleaning. Chris, I'll start with yourself.
Well, look, after 40 years and 6 contract changes, I think Defence owes me direct employment, and then just a contractor to manage the contract. That would be but you know, the chances of that happening are probably next to never. But it was just more that at the end of the contract, everything was over. That the incoming contractor must pay what the outgoing contractor was already paying. That we don't lose anything. That it is an easy changeover, where people aren't stressed, where buildings don't suffer and people don't suffer. It's not rocket science to make people happy, and they just want to know they've got a job, and that job is safe, and that they're paid properly, and that there's money in the bank. It is just that easy, just to show the smallest amount of respect.
Thanks, Chris. Martijn?
Yeah, I think I'd like to specifically have sort of a message for procurers, anyone who might be procuring cleaning services that's on the line. I think the challenge for those people is to make that human capital investment argument to the people that ultimately sign off on the contract, right? So, because I know that oftentimes that is the challenge. Like, how do you articulate the value, the added value of having a cleaning contract where there's a bit more money in it, that has secure employment, rather than purely someone signing off on it, looking at, well, which one's cheapest, right? And I think therein lies the challenge for procurers to say, look, there are a whole range of social and economic reasons to put a bit more money in a contract to make sure that there is secure employment, that there's better working conditions for cleaners. And, you know, being able to articulate that and making the moral case in addition to the business case that you're making to whoever signs off on the contract. I think that's where the challenge resides. But you don't have to start from scratch. There's lots of organizations, among which CAF, obviously, that give the good example of what contract provisions should look like, that give the good example of what respectful engagement looks like. But I think therein lies the challenge, and that's where, you know, procurement people can be real change makers within organizations as well.
And Rebecca?
Yeah, I'd like to focus on the role of procurers as well. And as Martijn said, I think they need to ensure that they're preferencing contractors who offer fair wages, decent work, and more secure forms of employment. So that could include, you know, a greater proportion of full-time day cleaners at their sites, which might be, you know, a bit of a structural change to how they run things. But the more visible you make the cleaners, the more sort of respected and valued I think they become in the workplace as well. It means, you know, stopping this use of part-time workers as almost sort of casual, you know, dispensable workers who could just be moved in and out when wanted. You know, you need to ensure that there are part-time arrangements that offer sufficient hours and regular hours, and you know, part-time cleaners aren't sort of surged up and down when they're needed. And minimising the use of casual labour as well, because that obviously is, you know, an even more insecure form of work than this sort of use of part-time. The other aspect is around subcontracting, so ensuring that you have measures in place for core cleaning services to be provided by the primary contractor, and that any subcontracted services are authorised by the procurer and are transparent. There's a whole bunch of things around change of contract that CAF already points to. We need to see more active participation and involvement of procurers around enforcing those standards. They need to play an active role in setting job security standards and managing the contract transition, and should put in place measures to ensure compliance. And I would also add that they need to consult with unions and cleaners around contract change, particularly if the proposed changes result in significant changes to hours and rosters. You know, the fundamental principle we want to make sure we have in place at contract change is that employers and procurers are working together to make sure that cleaners do not lose their rights, benefits, or hours when that contract changes ends.
Thank you, Rebecca, Martijn, and Chris, for your very insightful contributions today. We do have a few minutes for Q&A. I will check to see what's in the... There are no questions yet. So I
think we couldn't have been clearer in our message then.
Yeah.
That's the takeaway from that.
If you would like to ask a live question, let us know in the chat and we can unmute you, or you can unmute yourself. I do have some additional questions, but I'll leave a bit of a pregnant pause before I do. Okay, so based on your experience, how can we encourage contract owners to commit to maintaining and ideally improving employees' working conditions during contract changes rather than focusing mainly on lowering costs? So I think this is something that all three panelists have spoken to a little bit, but is there anything you wanted to add in response to Jennifer's question? I think the human capital argument was an interesting one, Martijn.
Yeah, well, actually, I was waiting for Chris to speak. I think one of the things that was so telling is that she said, oh, there's, you know, when she wasn't recognized as being in the building, and someone like, oh, there's a stranger here. And I think it wasn't too long ago that you would know the people that would clean your workplace, or in my case, you know, I remember the school cleaner was like someone who was there the whole time, you know. And there's again, it's those intangibles, or those things that you wouldn't think twice about having a workforce you recognize, people that know the place, that know the building, that know the people. And it's thinking that through in making your argument to the contract owners, to say, well, look, would we have someone here who knows the ropes, who knows the people, who knows the building, who can efficiently clean the building, who likes being here, who is a part of our community here, you know, like, because that's ultimately also what we're talking about. And it's tough to make that argument, specifically when you have some sort of hyper-capitalist boss signing off on your on the contract. But thinking about that, but particularly how that potentially you know, relates to that business case. Like, everything obviously levitates towards business case, but think about, again, like I said, how that translates to reduced absenteeism, how that translates to better service provision, reduced turnover, all those, you know, reduced training costs, all that sort of jazz, and trying to make that argument as well. In addition to the argument of saying, look, we need to reduce risk of wage theft, we need to reduce risk of any form of exploitation in workplace, and you can do that as well through, you know, being part of CAF, or being sure that you have proper provisions in place to safeguard working conditions. So if you tally all that up, then you can make quite a convincing argument, I think. But it's the visibility of it, and particularly the invisibility that Chris referred to, which makes it challenging.
Thank you, Martijn. I think I just want to do a little bit of an acknowledgement to all the panel members and attendees now. So thank you everyone for attending the discussion today. We've recorded the discussion and we'll send out the recording to all attendees in the coming weeks so that you can share it with any of your contacts who may find it of interest. A special thank you to Christine, Rebecca and Martine for giving up their time today to present their insights and for their ongoing support of CAF and our mission to end exploitation in the cleaning industry. I'd also like to acknowledge the goodwill of CAF certification and pre-qualification stakeholders, many of whom are on the line today. And their commitment to addressing complex issues such as insecure work. So investigating and remediating labour issues is not often easy, but it is important and we encourage your leadership. Finally, I'd like to commend the CAF team who continuously navigate sticky issues such as insecure work through our certification scheme and who seek out ways to address those issues with stakeholders in a holistic and sustainable way. And I think, the very collaborative nature of CAF and, in terms of bringing the right people to the table to sit down and actually work through issues is such an invaluable thing for the property sector to have. I know that there are other industries that probably wish they had a CAF for their industry, and I think there's a lot of fantastic work being done by CAF members and stakeholders, and it's not always perfect. A lot of the work is iterative, it's hard work. There are tough conversations, but I think it's the only way. It's the only way to work through some of this. And I think everyone on the call today, understands that understands the work that needs to be done. So thank you, everyone. It's 12 p.m. I wish everyone a lovely rest of the day and week, and thank you for coming along. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Chris, in particular.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.